And all right, so we are going to get started. Welcome everybody to our monthly SciEngage meeting. My name is Jeff Hunt. I'm the director of LabX here at the National Academy of Sciences. My co-host slash organizer, sponsor, whatever you want to call it, Emily Cloyd from AAAS is unavailable. And so we have MC Longshore sitting in for her. Wave for everybody.
Hi.
So today we have a great collaborative project on infographics and visualizing data. So I get to just sort of kick it over to the team and let them present. So Mikey, take it away.
Well, thanks so much, Jeff. So hi, everyone. My name's Mikey Kantar. I'm here today with Dr. Yael Kisel, Dr. Colin Khoury, and Ellie Barber. And we're going to talk today about this really fun project that we did with AAAS on kind of the power of infographics. And I will do this very quickly. And so what we did is we were part of this really fun project where we got a group of about 18 people, and it's sharing the wrong screen there, so we'll do this, and we'll do that because and so you can see we got together a great group of scientists, artists, journalists, and started thinking about how can we visualize data, and we were really focusing on issues in plant science and agriculture, because that's where that's where so the project was led by myself, Colin, and Ari Novi of the San Diego Botanical Garden, and our background is in food and agriculture and botany. So we really focused on plant sciences, and we had this opportunity to reach out to all of these wonderful artists and scientists and really ask the question, how can we visualize data in a way that's meaningful and that's more accessible than our traditional scientific papers? And I want to just show you very briefly what, at the end of this project, what we had. So we shared these at the AAAS meeting. And what we did is all of our scientists and artists ended up having different aesthetics. What you're seeing here are three graphics, one on smallholder farming, one on plant breeding and phenotyping, and one on agroecology. Ellie did this the graphic here on the left on small farms, and what we did is we matched scientists and artists based on topics that they were interested in, and then let their own aesthetic view of how the topic how they felt the topic would go. And here are the other set on that Colin made these ones with Alvaro and Kelsey, and I apologize, I'm forgetting how to pronounce their last names right now. But on where our food comes from, and then also the one here on the left is on pollinators, and then on grafting. Pollinators, Yael made this one. And what we really tried to do is put as few constraints as possible on the science-artist collaborations and really let them dig into the topic and figure out how they could develop something that both was visually appealing but was also fit their own personal sets of aesthetics, as well as let them convey the information. And before I hand it off to Colin, who's going to talk about this from the scientist perspective, and then we're going to hear from Yael and Ellie on the artist perspective on these. What I want to say is, both Yael and Colin did a great job because they made their infographics in both Spanish and English. And so they again, working really hard to think through who are our multiple audiences and how we can and hopefully if any of you were at the AAAS meeting, we had both the English and Spanish versions up. I actually have the Spanish versions outside my office, and people seem to like it's interesting. People are always comment on that as opposed to the English versions, which are also up. But my impression is just it was a really fun project. It's one of the easiest projects I've had in terms of getting people to sign on and want to participate. You know, a lot of times it's hard to get people to join projects. This one was not. So with the cat crossing, that is my cue. Colin, take it away.
Hi, good morning and afternoon. Hopefully you can hear me. Let me know in the chat if you can't hear me. And hopefully at this point my screen is going to share. Is that John? Great. So my task over just the next couple of minutes is to try from the researcher side, from the scientist side, to talk a little bit about this experience and what we learned from it. And what I'm going to do is explain my own perspective, my own experience from it, and then I've also gathered thoughts from the other researchers who are listed and photoed here. As Mikey mentioned, we all share background in food and agricultural research or plant sciences. All of us, I think, with some focus on societal relevance in relatively complex subjects. And the organizers, which I also was one of in the project, purposely chose subjects that we thought were somewhat complicated or perhaps even in some ways misunderstood by some of the public. And so we wondered whether some of these visuals would be more effective than other ways that we've tried to explain ourselves as scientists. The other thing is that I think all of us had some previous experience in science communications and trying to communicate beyond our small research community. That said, I think all of us did learn a lot through the project, and that was surprising, actually, I think, even to some of us. And so here's where I share some of those lessons. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about my process. This was the research in the paper, which was published a couple of years ago, that I decided to focus on. It had quite a bit of attention in the press. It was on a subject that perhaps had some interest to people. It was about where food comes from, its origins, and then where do people now eat those foods or produce those foods around the world. And one of the key pieces that I think made it effective or interesting to the public was this map, which is one of the figures. And I'm a geographer, and so obviously maps come naturally to me. And I thought, well, how can we start to visualize where foods originated or where they came from? Our second figure then was trying to explain not only where they came from, but where they're eaten or produced now. And we borrowed from the genomics community, from figures and open source codes, to produce this relatively crazy figure, which is more or less not understandable, but basically makes us understand that all the regions around the world, which are all of these different acronyms or codes, are connected to each other with regard to where the foods that they eat or produce originated. And so I thought a lot after this process about the effectiveness of these two figures, both of which we built in-house, actually without science communication colleagues, but with my own scientific colleagues that had some expertise in producing visuals. And I think that in the end, the map was quite effective. This circle diagram called Circos was powerful, but not that understandable. But I figured that we could do more, and particularly do more in explaining about food and its origins through foods that people relate to better. That is, not just crops, wheat and corn and those sort of things, but meals or dishes. And so the original idea that I approached my collaborators, artist collaborators, who both came with quite a lot of experience of working for National Geographic, was to try to break down an ingredient or a dish like the hamburger and explained where each part came from, and then put it together for people in a way that might be more powerful. One of the first sort of findings as we started to get into it was that the designers felt that there was way too much information for a flat visual, which is what we were aiming for in this project, an infographic. And therefore it would be much better online, perhaps through a web application where you could scroll. We had set in this project a constraint that we did want it to be print visual. And so that was an additional challenge for us to try to get it into something that that could fit essentially on one page. 81 emails, and 3 months later, we came up with these 3 different infographics. In fact, not just one. One focused on the hamburger, one on pad thai, and one on pizza. And I think on the PowerPoints, they are a bit small to see each individually. One you can see a little bit further, but it does break down the ingredients and has these maps underneath it of showing where the foods in those ingredients originally came from. And then it has a map at the bottom that reflects the sum total of that dish and where its origins are. Tried to pass this around to quite a lot of colleagues and family, etc., and do think that it was an advancement in terms of the messages that I was trying to convey. And so I was happy with that. And I think the designers, even though they were frustrated without being able to put it immediately online, were happy with the product as well. As a last slide I want to show you before I get into some of the other lessons from the other researchers, infographics certainly aren't new. This is an infographic basically of the same message from 1948 that I found, and it's hopelessly confusing in my opinion, but it is that same message. And I think what we started to realize at this time in 2019 was that there's new technologies, new audiences, new ways to communicate do necessitate new forms of making these visuals and new forms of infographics, including different ones online than in static print. Just a final couple of lessons, mostly from the other researchers, but I'll start with one more from myself. So there's definitely a tension sometimes between the scientist's desire that the information is totally accurate, totally detailed on all the points that one wants to convey, and the artists who have much more experience in interest piquing or relatability to the public. And the titles for me on these were a challenge for me. I was not comfortable with them. They seemed too inflammatory, and the artists really felt that we should do that. And I still feel a little bit uncomfortable with them, but I'm happy they've gone out and they've generated some interesting discussions that way. One of the researchers mentioned that really 90% of the process for them was actually the first process of discussing message, refinement, clarity, internal clarity on exactly what do I want to say. After that, it was easy. I'm not sure the designers would particularly say that's entirely true because they did most of the work after that point. But it was a lot of work up front for the researchers. One of them suggested actually that their own process of actually trying to do a little bit of art would be helpful. They put together a bulleted list of stats and info and then rearranged them into a story. That is, what do I want to display and in what order? And then actually tried to make some simple graphics themselves. And that was very helpful, not only to understand what they wanted to do, but also to relate to their artist colleagues. One final note is that numerous of the researchers in the project felt that the process itself helped not only with the communications of the research, but helped their research itself. And what I mean by that is that their process of trying to understand exactly what their key point is and drill down on that, what their audience and what the framing should be, why their research mattered, looped back around into making their papers, making their scientific presentations, etc., better processes. That's all I'd like to say. I'm now going to switch it over to our artist colleagues.
Hi, everyone. I am Ellie Barber, and I work for the Aspen Global Change Institute as our creative communications person. Let me get my screen sharing. Okay, can you see that? Yeah, okay. So the Aspen Global Change Institute is a research institute based in climate science. And so my position here is to basically distill the climate science that's happening at the Institute to a broader audience, typically through infographics and short videos, animated videos, and that sort of thing. So this project was really fun for me. It was within the wheelhouse that I work at AGCI, but was new in that we had so many different collaborators, which was really fun. And so now myself and then Yael will talk about kind of the designer side of the process and lessons learned as a designer. So the first one is simplicity. And interestingly enough, some of these points also speak to what Colin was just saying. But basically, simplicity is not to be scared of. And I think something that I've run into is that scientists see simplifying as dumbing things down. And I think when you're communicating these types of things, it doesn't have to be dumbing things down. And I think that's what the discussion is all about, is that 75-90% of the project really could be about discussion and really just getting you to the point where the designer can understand and then translate it. And so it's kind of our job to say, I don't get it, explain it again. I don't get it, explain it again. And because likely a lot of the audiences, it seems, that we're working for and trying to communicate to are, a general public, which we'll talk about more. But the general public has an 8th grade education level about science typically. And so thinking about, like, how would I explain this to a middle schooler? And that's really the point we're trying to get to. Another point that has come up for me is the difference between data visualization and information design. And information design is a term that is not as common, but it's basically interpreting data and understanding data from a designer point of view, and then understanding the concept that's trying to be conveyed, and not necessarily representing the data to scale, which is a really scary thing for science. And I think me also coming from a science background, I at first was like very concerned about this idea, but as a designer, you start to realize that sometimes all that data is there backing up an idea, and sometimes you just need to convey the idea. So I'll give some examples of this. These are 2 visualizations from the graphic that I produced on small farms. On the left, you'll see data visualization. It's an exact representation of the data. We used, R to get this image. On the right, you've got more of a conceptual diagram of the difference in size between small farms and larger farms. And what was difficult about this looks incredibly simple, but took a lot of conversation because larger farms is a huge scale. And here we have this square is, it says, larger farms are roughly this big, about 100 hectares. But the asterisk says these larger farms can go up to 9.1 million hectares. And so trying to figure out how to represent that, and we decided it was best to kind of lump together this idea of larger farms and go towards the majority instead of conveying the entire spectrum of what these farms are. So another example of this is the information design versus data visualization comes from the London Underground maps. And this is something that's talked about in information design, where in 1908, when the first map came out, it was to scale, and it showed exactly where the stops were. It showed all of the waves and everything, and it's really hard to see, and they weren't seeing much ridership. And then eventually in 1949, after a few iterations, they got to this map you see on the right, which is very simple, only 90-degree angles and 45-degree angles. It's not to scale. You don't see the towns on the outskirts represented far on the outskirts. They're equidistant from each other, but it got the point across that to writers that like, if you go this way, you'll go here. And they actually saw a pretty significant rise in ridership with the change of the map. So that's another example of this idea of communicating what your audience really wants to know. So speaking of audiences, this is obviously a really important one as well, and a lot of the designers talked about this in our lessons learned, is to first identify your audience. Who are you trying to communicate to? And the answer is not everyone, because an academic audience has a totally different language than a more public audience. And you really can think about it as language. Like you can't speak Spanish to someone who speaks English, or you can't speak different languages to each other and expect that you'll be able to communicate. And so making sure that your language is on par with each other and working from there is really important. And so a lot of the designers in this project ended up doing a third-party check with our infographics. So when we started to have an idea for a design, we would run it by a family member or a friend who's totally uninvolved in the process, and then you can kind of gauge, like, does this make sense to you? And they can give you an example of things that could be improved, or of things that really do make sense. Another point is that communication doesn't necessarily mean saying everything that you want to say. So this is similar, going back to what I was saying, the difference between data visualization and information design. It's not about you, it's about the audience. You may want to say your entire research paper to someone, but really maybe all they care about is the thesis. And then saving the rest of that dialogue of your research paper to people that care about the methods, the discussion and all of that. And figuring out exactly what matters to the audience. Another one is to incorporate stories and emotion. These are two snippets from my graphic on the right and Yael's on the left. And basically this idea that when you're able to personalize information, it becomes more relatable to people. And when people relate to things, they're much more likely to remember it, to share it with people they know, and to really, have it hit their heart. And that actually matters. And I think this is a major challenge with science, is that it's purposefully objective. And so to create some sort of emotion with those objective facts can be really difficult, but that's why this type of communication is so awesome. And so about a note on storytelling, this is becoming more and more important in the communication sphere. And some people are talking about this, the Pixar method of storytelling, which is once upon a time, there was blank. Every day, blank. One day, blank. Because of that, blank. Because of that, blank. Until finally, blank. And if you look at every Pixar film, it follows this method. And it really, it can be distilled to this. So if there's a way to create this type of storytelling in your research, I think it can be really powerful. And I personally didn't use this in my graphic, but it's been a hot topic among science communicators. And I would challenge you all to kind of try this with just telling stories in general to your friends or family, or trying to morph your research into this format and seeing how it goes and seeing how it resonates with people, because these stories really can create more of an emotional component to the research. And lastly, before I pass it off to Yael, iteration is important and inevitable. And Yael will go into this a little bit more, but this is where the magic happens. This is what Colin was talking about. It's distilling and distilling and distilling, but it also means that the process will probably take longer than you think it will. Each of these graphics took 20 to 30 hours to create. And so if you think about, they look so simple, but there's actually so much complexity that happens before they are simplified, because simplicity is such an important part of designing something effectively without scaring off someone. Kind of incorporating that into your thought process when you're planning for one of these graphics, or when you're writing it into a grant, expecting that, you know, the longer you take on this that's actually that's a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. So I'll pass it off to Yael now.
All right, thanks, Ellie. Let me just get my screen share going. All right, you can see that, right? Okay, so a word about myself, so you don't get the wrong idea. I'm a scientist, really, but I like doing art stuff as well, and so Colin roped me in on this project. So it was interesting being on the artist side, but understanding it from the scientist side as well. Although I think, yeah, maybe I'm not as scientisty about wanting to have all the data represented. So I was on the right side. Anyway, so I wanted to talk to you start off with the iteration point. I'll show you the draft process for the infographic that I made, which was about plant-pollinator interaction network structure, which, if that sounds long and complicated, then you can see my challenge in making a simple infographic about it. So for us, well, we can, ooh. Oh man, okay. So I'll start you off on, this is the first draft I made. You can see that it's really different. So the big challenge for me in the infographic, as Ellie alluded to and Colin, was not about the style and the art itself. It was really figuring out how to fit the story onto the page. And so in my first discussion with Nacho, the scientist I was working with, it seemed so simple. He was like, let's have this example of a table, and then we'll like move on to showing the networks, and then we'll say this is there's a problem here, done. And then I was like, okay, I'll just draw that and we'll be done. And then I showed it to a friend and she said, I have no idea what this means. And like that drawing of a bee, that's very funny and that's nice, but then you get into this third panel and suddenly you threw like a whole bunch of jargon at me that I don't know what it means, and I have no way to interpret this. Like, okay. So then we basically went back to the drawing board like 3 times, because it was really challenging to figure out how to convey a really specialized and abstract topic. So in our case, rather than trying, like Colin had a particular research paper that he wanted to share the results of, or the main point of, and in this case, it was more that Nacho wanted to share what his research is about in general. So we just wanted to get people to understand that it's not that just the individual pollinator species that we need to protect to have working ecological networks, but we also need to protect the whole communities, all the different pollinators, because the interactions between the pollinators and the plants, it's important to have that web of different interactions so that if some are lost, you still have things working. And you can tell that I haven't thought about this in a couple of months because I can't explain it clearly anymore. Anyway, so we wanted to explain that, but there's a whole bunch of ideas there that people don't know, so we needed to kind of give the background information first. So and then so this is the next draft that Nacho made. So this is like the idea of the scientists trying to do some graphics and structure. That helps, but it still felt like things weren't in the right order. I came back with another draft. This is another draft. This is the first of 4 pages. So like I really decided to break it down and try to explain what an interaction network is by telling people that it's like customers in restaurants, and that kind of worked, but then it was way too long because we wanted to make something that was 1 page and could be shared on social media. And there were way too many words. I wanted there to be very few words. In our case, it turned out to be, I did a lot of the storytelling work. I asked Nacho to send me references, like he sent me a textbook chapter about plant-pollinator interaction networks and their structure, and I read that in order to understand what he was talking about when he was telling me about how they work and why the structure is important. And then thought about it a lot and eventually came up with another draft. Actually, and in here, for me, the key part was trying to understand also how am I going to get people to care about this? Like Ellie was saying, you need a story, and it's not enough to just say, here's this thing, but because Nacho really wanted to have a kind of a call to arms kind of a thing. Like, it's not just about honeybees or saving individual local bee species. You want to get people to care about the structure, but how do you get them to care when it's like without making some overly broad, kind of not entirely true statements? And so then I had a conversation with my boyfriend. It's always useful to talk to anyone who's around you. And he suggested linking it to like something in the news, things that people had heard of. So that's when we put in colony collapse and neonicotinoid pesticides, which have been in the news, at least the environmental news. So we ended up deciding that we really couldn't aim this at a general audience like Ellie was talking to, but this had to be about people, aimed at people who were already interested in conservation and maybe already knew that they had to care about the bees, and then we could take them one step further. And so that way we could start off, not having to explain what ecology was. So then this is an almost final draft, and then again we showed it to different people and they said like, oh, I don't understand what that part is, so I took it out. And Nacho said, well, why, switch the plants to be underneath and the bugs on top. I'm like, okay. So this was, but at this point at least we knew that the general idea was what we wanted, and then we got to the almost final draft, and then there were still a few changes after this, like deciding that I wanted the people to be purple so that they wouldn't be, not any particular race or nationality, and make it as welcoming to everybody as possible. Anyway, so if people have more questions about the process, then I can answer those. This is just wanted to give a kind of behind the scenes specific look at one process, but everyone's process is a little bit different. So some other things that I think are good takeaways. So for one, it definitely, for something like this, does not work for the scientists to just be like, here's what I want you to make a graphic about, and then they go away and the artist makes a graphic and it's done. Because at the end of the day, the scientist knows best, actually knows what it's all about, and the artist, even no matter how much research they do, they're never going to know the topic as well as the scientist. There needs to be a dialogue there so that it really ends up being what the scientist wants it to be and can use. Another thing is that, unless the scientist has an exact idea of how they want to tell the story and they're good at that, and all they need is an artist to draw some pictures, the artist is going to need to understand what the research is about in order to be able to make good artistic and communication decisions about what to put in, what to take out, and how to tell the story. So the scientist is going to need to provide materials to the artists to help them understand what they're communicating. And as I alluded to, the actual visuals are really the last step, at least in my experience. The first thing, which I put second, but the first thing to figure out is what your goal is with an infographic or with a communications product, because there's always many different ways to tell a story, and you want to tell the story in the way that achieves what you want to achieve. So first you have to know what you want to achieve, and that can be surprisingly tricky. Like in our case, Nacho had this idea that he wanted people to care about the interaction network structure and not just individual bee species. And that's almost there, but then who does he want to have care about those things? What does he want them to do with that information? Why does he want them to care? There's like all sorts of little finicky things about the goal that you really need to figure out before you can make a good graphic, or you're going to have to figure them out along the way, and you might have to change things a lot. The more you can figure out at the beginning, the best. the better. So you figure out your goal and your audience, and then you can develop the story and the structure. And then at the end, after that, then you develop your actual visuals, which is why most of the pictures I showed you are really ugly sketches with ballpoint pen on scrap paper, because it wasn't important at that point that it looked good. It was just trying to figure things out. And the last point I want to make here is that as far as I'm concerned, and I mean, artists are different, but it's totally cool for the scientist to say, I have this idea for a visual metaphor, or I'd like it to look like this. Like, don't feel like that's not your side of the line or the table or something. You should be ready for the artist to say, no, I don't think that's a good idea, but you can at least come to them with ideas. So that's cool. And then we were, in preparing for this webinar, one of the things we thought we wanted to talk about was what are potential barriers to collaborations between scientists and artists. And I think on the one hand, and something that was also brought up when we did the workshop at the AAAS meeting in February, is that not every artist might be good to work on a science infographic, or might be able to do a good job, depending on what the scientist needs in the collaborator, because it's difficult to make an effective graphic without understanding the science. So the artist needs to be at least interested, hopefully have enough science background in the topic, in the particular topic, or be willing to learn. And so even in my case, I'm a biologist. I've learned about plant pollinator interactions before, but I didn't know very much or at all about the interaction network structure. And it took me like quite a bit of work to really understand the fine kind of subtle details that my scientist collaborator wanted to get across. So the artist has to be interested in the science, and then also they're going to need some time to wrap their head around exactly what the science is. And then on the other side, I think the scientists really need to trust the artists. Like, if you're going to work with an artist, hopefully it's because you think that they know how to do art and tell a story. And so it's not a problem that I had in this case, but I can see it as being something that comes up, especially with the data visualization, information design thing. Like, at the end of the day, please trust your artist. Like, there are reasons why they are suggesting to cut things out or change things. And it's not because they don't care about your science, but because they have a feeling for how it's going to come across to the reader or people who are consuming the science product. And then finally, we got a lot of questions about where to find artists to work with. We've been getting questions about this. And this is a thing that is still hard. I think these networks are only just growing. But here are 3 resources that I know of. And if anyone else knows more, we can put it in the chat. Science Finds Art at the top is super new. It only went online like in the last month, and they're still growing and changing. Like, they only added infographics as a category like a couple of weeks ago, I think, but they do have infographics and diagrams on there now as a category. There's the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators, which is, I think, more focused on straight natural science illustration, like pictures of birds and things like that, but they, again, include a lot. And then there's scienceart.com, which is a place where scientific artists can put portfolios online. And so all 3 of these are specifically set up as ways for scientists to be able to find artists to work with. And I think that is all I've got. So maybe I'll turn it over to Mikey, and then we can have some questions.
Thanks so much, Colin, Yael, and Ellie. Yeah, and so I, it was really a fun project. And before we open it up to questions, one thing that I would like to say is all of the people who I talked to were really into this. All of the collaborators, all of the scientists at the AAAS meeting, everyone who I've talked to about this project, and this question of where do I find a person to work with, I think, is huge. And I think one of the things that we've found is that when you're building these networks, if you really want to build them in, you have to value the artist's time, and you have to value this as really part of the project. So you have to really build it into the grant writing process and realize if this is something you have to do, it's really, really part of the budget. And then connecting people again on this idea of common interests, but also common aesthetic. Because lots of people, again, as I've been sharing the infographics across all of the across my network, it's very interesting how different people are really drawn to the different aesthetics of the different artists that we've seen. And so I really that's just something that we really found. It's a topic that excites people. It's a topic that people want to work on, but the idea of it can't be something that's added in as obviously you should be doing it, because it's not obvious, because it is a time-consuming process that requires a lot of skill. And so I guess this would be a question for everyone. I'm seeing what software is best for the infographics, and I think this would be for you, Ellie and Yael.
When I was making mine, I used Adobe Illustrator, which is a program that I have training in, and that's what I'm most comfortable with. I'm also gravitating into the tablet and Apple Pencil method. Yael, I don't know what you used for yours.
I used Photoshop and then imported everything into Adobe Illustrator to finish up, because I wanted to have vector graphics that could be scaled up or down, because I knew we were going to have posters printed. And I think in general, though, whatever you're comfortable with is the best thing. I've also used GIMP as a free alternative to Photoshop, and I've tried Inkscape, which is the open source alternative to Illustrator, but I really didn't like it, so I keep paying for Illustrator.
And in the chat, we have Illustrator, InDesign, Photoshop is really the top of the line. Our question: as a designer rather than a scientist, how would you recommend we connect with scientists?
I think
go ahead.
Twitter is probably a good place. I've been noticing how much science stuff goes on Twitter. But I think there's lots of ways.
So I would say, as a scientist, there's a lot of people at universities. I mean, so and some of the nonprofits who are actively looking for these things, particularly if there are science communication organizations. And hopefully everyone's looking at the chat. There's at 500 Women Scientists is a good one. There's some really good science communication things on Twitter. But what I would say is almost every university has a science communication or multiple science communication groups. Here at the University of Hawaii, there's a university-wide one, there's an oceanography one, there's a conservation biology one, and there's a climate change. All four of those have separate science communication efforts going on. Probably better if they were all work together, but they all have their own individual thing. But also the environmental law program has its own science communication group as well. And so the thing is, if you can engage in some of these groups that are already going on, and probably your best bet is actually really engaging with graduate students in a lot of cases, because they're graduate students and postdocs, I would say, are really at kind of they're really into a lot of it. And sorry, I'm trying to keep up with the questions. What about getting scientists realizing they want the graphics? Where's the output goals for the scientists? So, Colin, maybe you want to take a stab at that one.
Yeah, that's a rich question. Thanks for it. We had the opportunity to write up our thoughts on this and are about to publish it in a scientific journal, which is, of course, kind of within the fold of the scientific community. So it's somewhat oriented towards researchers and convincing them that this is useful. I do think it will probably be, no, let me rephrase it the other way. I think it will become more and more of an incentive or clear the more that organizations such as the one that I work for incorporate, for instance, social media attention into the way that we understand impact. And the more that donors to our research explicitly fund or prioritize good visuals, both within the outputs of projects, but also even within the proposals to them. And so we did come up with a couple of recommendations like that hopefully will get to the donors, will get to organizations, and have them understand the importance of visuals so that their researchers will be supported in understanding that can be a great process for them.
And so actually, I'm gonna skip down a little bit and have you talk about one. I know, Colin, that you've been we have a question about working with science museums, and I would say that I know Colin has actively worked with science museums, and another collaborator on the project, Zia Morabi, has also worked with science museums, and obviously we're well connected with the botanical garden community. But if you want to talk at all about your science museum work in Brazil, Colin, that would be that's something that we're definitely a huge fans of.
Well, actually, I just want to make a note. Thank you for that question. And it says, have you all ever considered reaching out to science museums? We've thought a lot after this about how artists and graphic designer professionals might have more opportunities. And we listed a couple of links that we found, but one of the things that we're really proposing is actually that professionals create more companies, more organizations, and more networks. We haven't thought about it, I think, so much from the side, and it's not that particularly us researchers are thinking about creating a network where we can help those who communicate to the public, but perhaps we should. We do have that, of course, with, for instance, the entertainment industry, that there are scientists and part of a network connected to Hollywood, et cetera. And perhaps we could look more at creating a database of researchers that want to communicate more with the public. Thanks.
So we'll go back. We have a question about the scientific posters and transforming scientific posters. I actually haven't thought about that much. It's a great idea. Yael, Ellie, have you guys thought about actually using some of these principles of information design and art in science posters, or talk to anyone about those?
I've had a few discussions about that, and I think mostly the discussions are while at a conference. People are like, "Oh my gosh, I saw this poster. It was so cool. It was an infographic," and it's like a really nice way to weed through the many words that are in posters at conferences. And I think that's, I'm a designer, so I'm a little biased here, but like I think that really does draw people in, and really, at least in my experience, you just want to get the conversation started. You want to pull someone in and then talk to them maybe about your research. And so it is a really effective way to do that. And I think the one challenge there is making sure, like Mikey said, that it's in the budget sort of for the project ahead of time, because it does take a lot of time to distill these huge research ideas into an infographic. So yeah, that's one thing that has to be considered ahead of time, but I think it's a wonderful idea.
If I can jump in, I know that for me personally, every time I've been to a conference and walked around, I've wished all the posters were infographics or designed to be more fun to look at. But I also have gotten the feeling that part of the reason they look like they do is because a lot of scientists want posters that look like that. I know many people who want to see all the data and have all the words available to look at. So I think, like, you know, for us people who like the more storytelling stuff, it might be obvious that like it would be better if everything were different, but not everybody feels that way. And so there's going to be always a, you know, like people will have what they want. But I would be happy to transform posters for anybody who wanted me to pay me to do that.
Yeah, I would say that if any of you have any questions or interest in this type of thing, all of us are welcome to talking with you and further collaboration. Mikey, I don't know if our contacts are listed somewhere.
I think MC, we can make them available, right, to everyone. We'll make that all available. So sorry to catch up. We have the question. Having infographics can be argued as part of the dissemination process. We completely agree, and we argue that that should be, and that should really be built in as a broader impact. And speaking in K-12 key teachers, I'm part of several K-12 education initiatives, and that's where I've seen some of the greatest success of the infographics. They love them. They really love them, particularly. Your insects that are looking very scared at the top of the at the top of your infographic. I mean, the students love that. It immediately draws them in. You know, they're like, oh, I should care about this. Why are the bees so scared? You know, and things like that.
That is the takeaway. If you put a face on any inanimate object, it changes everything.
Yeah, and yeah, and they you know, they love it. So moving down on some of the other questions, I think this is a great idea where we say our in-house designer recently transformed a scientific poster. And also I've seen that the Mike Morrison's the NPR and all of that. I think that that's a great discussion, and I think your point, Yael, is well taken though as well. A lot of scientists don't want it to be for a lay audience, right? So and I've seen particularly there's been a lot of discussion here at UH about the new poster format, and some people are actually quite vocally opposed to it because they say the point of the scientific discussion is to include everything. I happen to disagree with them because again, I get overwhelmed when there's 1,200 posters and and you know, just rows and rows of people. I get overstimulated, but I think that that's again something to really think about. Again, who's your audience? And that's something I think that we came back to again and again and again. Who is your audience for these visuals, and how do we incorporate them and really reach those audiences? And I would say another thing, building on this with the idea of kind of the broader impacts, one of the things that our discussions, and correct me if I'm wrong, Yael and Colin, but one of the things that we started talking about, if you're serious about them and you really want them to be broad, it can't be an afterthought in the granting process and the project design. It has to be upfront, and you can't pretend that it's something that is not that you can do for $500 as an afterthought, or that you can, you know, it has to be that strategy and that process has to be a part of your grant if you really care about it. I don't know. It'd be great to get thoughts from everyone else, or if anyone else on at the webinar has other thoughts.
I mean, I don't think that outreach and impact necessarily has to be expensive, and possibly you can, you know, after you do your research, start to plan it then, but it will always take time, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would say with the graphic projects, if you do want to work with a designer, designers typically are charging, you know, $80 to $150 an hour. And so if you calculate that for 30 hours for a graphic, it can be, you know, $3,000 plus or minus dollars to create this type of thing. And so it is a significant enough amount where that's usually not, at least in my experience with academic grants, that's usually not how much is left over at the end. So yeah, writing it in the beginning.
And also, I don't. One of the things as well is, again, for academic grants, you have to have it in the right budget category, which is again important. Why you need to think about it at the beginning of the project, because sometimes things aren't as flexible budgetarily as you would like. And I think building these collaborations in and being upfront again as an artist with your scientist collaborators, this is what it costs to do. I think is important, and I think for scientists to recognize, that that's part of the process.
Can I drop in here for a minute?
Yes, of course, please.
Slightly different subject. I'm really fascinated, somewhat obsessed with a couple of the comments that were about how researchers can be more helpful, and it was mentioned that to organizations like museums or to teachers and in schools, if you wouldn't mind typing in anyone else who has ideas about audiences. Just type them into the chat. I'd actually really appreciate it. Maybe we can compile them and think more deeply about it. Thanks.
Yeah, and if anyone has any ideas, one of the things that I would that I've been thinking about, and I don't know if any of you guys do this as well, are science fair judges. But at all the science fairs, they have students doing posters, videos, podcasts as their science fair projects, and one of the things is, it'd be great to get a lot of this SciComm curriculum as actually built in to that science education perspective, so that I see all the comments about posters, which are fantastic, but the ninth graders who are giving posters are giving the same poster format that we're seeing at conferences, and that's probably not great in my opinion, right? And I think a lot of, again, like you said, Colin, get these audiences there, get them early so that they can think about it as not an afterthought, but an integral part of the process. I think is something that's important. So I guess we're reaching the end of our hour. Does anyone have any other comments? Oh, there's a project. Caitlin said there's a project designing a showcase for headquarters. Sorry, they're popping up. Include new nutritionists. You guys are good at typing. Well, I just want to thank you guys so much for attending. It's been a ton of fun for us. Thank you, Yael, Ellie, and Colin. Yeah, and Jeff is there. MC, is there anything else we should add? Oh, sorry, Jeff, I can't hear you. We can't hear you, Jeff.
Much better. What I was going to say is, if there are any links or contact information you want to share, you can send that to us, and we will get it posted on the AAAS website where we have the event listed. The recording of this will be posted on YouTube, so you'll be able to watch it over and over again. We'll also include the chat there with all the links. So that should be it.
Well, thanks so much. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you for attending.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.